Hello, it's Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with another U.S. 2022 Senate midterm update. So, what has happened since last week? Well, first, I've now added Colorado as a full-fledged model, and the full-fledged model puts in the exact same spot that the paper or napkin model did. So, simplified model and real model, so far, 100% in agreement. I cannot say the same is necessarily true with every other state using this simplified model. That said, I don't think it should be really any surprise to anyone that Colorado is relatively safe for the Democrats. For various reasons, over the last about 20 years, Colorado's been one of the states that has shifted quite a lot. One of the other ones you could argue would be, say, Ohio or Florida. This is not an exhaustive list, by the way. This always happens. There's been this kind of like perception in the U.S. that what is a safe red state or what is a safe blue state or what's a toss-up or swing state is static. And that's really just not true at all. Every state has a slightly different population to it. In just some high-level categories, different combination of races, different economic situations, different industries people work in, different education levels, different religious groups, etc., etc. There's all sorts of different permutations of those. And that's all underneath the fact that different states have a different culture, however small it might be in difference to the generic American culture. So, states over time will drift as their demographics change, and the way their demographics change is not always going to be the same everywhere because, obviously, there are some trends, but not all of them are that strong of a trend. For example, a really strong trend is education. Though, I will put a caveat on this, which I'll get into in a second, but the general trend in education is the more educated you are, the more Democrat you are. I will put a caveat on this, though, because obviously the most educated being university or undergrads or postgrads, also tend to be significantly younger than the average population. And generally speaking, the younger you are, the more likely you're going to vote Democrat as well. So there's probably a very high correlation between those two variables, so I'm not sure how good education in general is by itself. In other words, I don't think if you took a hardcore Republican who worked as a oil rig worker and put him to a post-grad in history, he's suddenly going to be a progressive leftist. I think it's very likely the case that there is a self-selection bias causing this. It's not the act of education, it's the people seeking the education are the kind of people who are more likely to vote that way to begin with. So, in other words, the education, I don't think, is causing people to become Democrat, or lack of higher education doesn't cause people to be Republican. It's the people who chase the higher education tend to be the same kind of people who are more likely to be Democrat. Or in a more international viewpoint, more left-wing people seem to want higher education. Like on a personal level, they want university degrees, master's degrees, PhDs, etc. People who want those tend to be more left-wing, and people who don't care about those tend to be more right-wing. This isn't universally true, but that is a trend, and you have to be careful how you look at these trends. And there's all sorts of them. Obviously, there's some famous ones in the U.S., like black people in general historically have voted or Democrat like 90%. But that isn't a universal trend, because in some states, like if you go, let's say out west here, that number isn't the same as if you go in the deep south. in the Deep South, where a very, very large percentage of the black population lives, and generally speaking, this region, they are very much the national quote-unquote average, which is 90-10-ish. And most black people, generally speaking, live in this area. There's some over here, and there's some in other places too. But a very large percentage of them live around this area, and that colors the rest of the country. Because if you look at, say, black people in Nevada right now, by polling, they're close to, I think it's like 50-40 for the Democrats, the Republicans. Georgia, it's 90-10. So, yes, you do have demographic trends like this, but the important thing is local cultures, local issues are very important, and that's different by state. So, demographics are important, but demographics don't predict things themselves. If that makes sense. I hope this train of thought made sense to people. So what is all this to say? Why did I just go on this 5-minute spiel about demographics here? Well, places like Colorado in like the 80s, 90s tended to be more right-wing. It was more like its neighboring states like Wyoming, Kansas, Nebraska. I think I picked those backwards. And in the last 20, 30 years, it's drifted, and now Colorado tends to behave more like Washington or Oregon. Not entirely, but in general terms, they are more comparable to those two. There's a couple of reasons for this. Some of the easy ones you can spot is Colorado has a much higher educated populace. It is significantly more centralized and urban than, say, Wyoming or Nebraska or Kansas. Denver is a much larger city than any capital city in those states. Not 100% sure about Utah, but Utah is considered for a completely different reason than any other demographic would suggest there. And it seems culturally, some big cultural indicators, Colorado's typically less religious, and they typically are more quote-unquote white collar. I say quote-unquote because what is white collar work is not the cleanest division line in the world, but it is a good category. Whereas on the flip side, you have Ohio. Ohio used to be one of the swingiest states in the U.S. Very swingy. I want to say for like 60 or 70 years it's been one of the swingiest states in the U.S. Right now, though, ever since 2016, I might even say go back all the way to like 2014, possibly. Ohio's not a swing state anymore, at least not meaningfully. Like, if we're calling Ohio a swing state, then we're almost implicitly saying, like, most of the Midwest is a swing state. Like, yes, I will say that the margins in Ohio are going to be lower than Indiana. But many people, for example, will consider Washington safe Democrat. I think that's reasonable. Like if you're talking about presidential elections. And then they'll say Ohio's a swing state. No. As long as the Republican Party stays in the current position it is, and Ohio's economic and cultural indicators stay where they are, Ohio's not a swing state for the MAGA Republicans. It's quite complicated why that is, but long story short, as with much of the Midwest, like Pennsylvania, Michigan, lesser extent Wisconsin, it is part of the Rust Belt. And I guess you could throw upstate New York in that too. Now, why is that significant? This is the biggest reason why Ohio's not a swing state anymore. And it's also a big reason why Michigan's not particularly safe, and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania are very competitive. Michigan tends to lean slightly bluer than, say, Wisconsin or Pennsylvania. Well, basically the last 40 years has destroyed the Rust Belt. just straight up. The globalization and the offshoring of industries has more or less destroyed those states. You can see quite clearly, since the number of electoral college votes hasn't changed, like in the absolute quantity. You look at 1980 to today, I'm not going to say all of these, but Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio all have significantly lower electoral college votes than they did in 1980. A big reason for that is out-migration from those states to the rest of the U.S. caused by economic despair in these states as industries, like literal manufacturing industries, like a factory that builds a thing, have left to go overseas. This was once the industrial heartland of the U.S. It's not anymore. So why does that make this area suddenly much more competitive for MAGA Republicans, and why is Ohio safe? Michigan's not safe. Well, the peculiarities of Michigan versus Ohio are a factor. Michigan is much more centralized and has a much bigger city. In general terms, the bigger the city you live in, the more liberal you're going to be. It's not perfect, but tends to be the case. Though, like education, I think it's much more likely that conservatives are just less likely to want to live in a big city than liberal, or living in a big city makes you a liberal, if that makes sense. Similarly, I think a lot of jobs that conservatives tend to do are more rural orientated. For just name some: oil, farming, mining, stuff like that. Those people who do those jobs tend to vote more conservatively, and those tend to be jobs that are done in rural areas. So there is a kind of a correlation. There's lots of cross correlations on these variables, so it's hard to say just one matters in and of itself. So Ohio has the right peculiarities combined with this shift that, because of the economic devastation and because of its particular character as a state, a soft protectionist pro-American faction, America First movement, is going to do very well here, because a lot of people who are tired, they're alienated, they don't like seeing their communities collapse, are saying, hell with it, the Democrats aren't helping us, we're going to go Republican. So this is causing Ohio to go Republican. This causes the opposite, is causing Colorado to go Democrat, and this will happen in many states. It's very possible right now we're seeing a shift. Maybe Georgia is shifting Democrat, possibly. Florida seems to be shifting more Republican, etc. There's all sorts of movement here, and I think you really have to keep this in mind when you're looking at the U.S. politics. This isn't static. It can seem static. It can look like there's, let's say, 20 red states, let's say 25 red states, 15 Democrat states, and 10 toss-up states, or swing states. But that's not entirely true. The states move. The coalitions change. Most famously, the South used to be deep blue. And for various reasons, it shifted, and now it's deep red, with possibly the exception of Georgia now. For example, Tennessee, in a presidential race, last voted for a Democrat in 96, I believe. So Tennessee's only been solid red for presidential vote for 20 years. That's just 5 elections. That's not much. Similarly, West Virginia is in a similar boat. I said that was kind of redundant, but whatever. West Virginia is in a similar boat. There's a couple other states in the South that are very similar. So it's a recent change. A lot of people watching this channel, or a lot of people who only half pay attention to politics, might not have noticed the change. And I think that's where you get this perception going. If you're young, and by young I mean probably under 40, because you don't really pay too much attention to politics for the first 20 years of your life unless you're weird like me. Even then, I'd probably only last 4 years, so stands. So if you haven't paid much attention for the last 20 years of your life, it will look like the map's pretty stagnant because a lot of the major changes happened just before you would have been politically active. Though now we're in another realignment, and I would argue these realignments seem to tend to happen every 20 years. It's not like suddenly, oh, it's 2040, time for realignment. It slowly happens over the course of 20 years, but you really only see it happen after about 20 years are through, because the realignment, I would implicitly argue, is generally caused by the turn of generations. There is this kind of pervasive myth that you occasionally see where it's like, young people right now are very liberal, so they're always going to be liberal, and then in 50 years from now, the Zoomers are going to be super liberal old people. No, not really. That's not a good way to look at it, because as you get older, as you go through life, as things happen to you, people tend to become more conservative, at least, if not morally, fiscally. When you are paying taxes for the government, you are much more concerned about getting something for your taxes. And if you're getting something for your taxes, you want the government to be more efficient. You don't want your tax money to be wasted, so you're more concerned about wasteful spending, and you're more concerned about paying less taxes. That is the basis for becoming more fiscally conservative, and that will happen to probably everyone who pays taxes. Yes, there are people, both rich and poor, who will never pay taxes, or at least meaningfully pay taxes, and that won't happen to them. But for those of us who do pay taxes, the act of paying taxes tends to make you more fiscally conservative on a political level. Tends, obviously. There's note, tends. On a social level, becoming a parent makes you, there's a lot of data on this. Becoming a parent tends to make people significantly more socially conservative. When you have a child, your number one concern is your child, and you don't want to rock the boat. You don't want the society you grew up, because clearly where you grew up couldn't have been that bad. You don't want it to change too heavily. Now, yes, in certain areas where your country might not be in a good condition, I don't want to pick on one, let's say Iran right now, not the best place in the world to live unless you are a very specific type of very religious Shia. If you're not that, not a great place. If you are that, I guess it's a great place. That's what you'd want. So, yes, in places like that, having a kid, if you are not the very religious Shia, you might want to have changes. But in general terms, in the US, the status quo is generally okay. Yes, there are problems here, there's problems there. You can point to things. But for the average person, the average middle class person, to be clear, the status quo is acceptable, and you don't really want to rock the boat too much, especially if you're having kids. That tends to make you more socially conservative on that end. And on a higher level end, once your kids start having to go to school, parents tend to be much more socially conservative when it comes to their education, because they want their kid to get good education, they want their kid to succeed, and they're very sensitive to what schools are teaching. That's why you look at places like Virginia in 2021, parents overwhelmingly voted for Youngkin because they were concerned about education. Same thing looks like it will be happening in Florida right now in this gubernatorial election. And you could probably look at a lot of other ones. So, what is all this to say? Well, I'll just finish this first thought here. A lot of things cause things to change here. So, states aren't going to be the same today, tomorrow. However, these things are not static, and you really have to keep that in mind. And I'm really stressing this one here because it's very easy to see, Colorado's always going to be blue, Washington's always going to be blue, Pennsylvania's, or that's a bad example, South Carolina's always going to be red, etc., etc. That's not true. Things will change. Things will happen. For now, the states I think you should watch for the next 10 years, probably Georgia, probably New Hampshire. I think Wisconsin will probably become relatively safe red relatively soon. Pennsylvania, I think, is probably going to stay as a swing state for a while now. But New Hampshire and Georgia, I think, are two ones to look out for. Possibly even Maine, if we want to extend that up. Vermont, because there's no good reason why Vermont... all the underlying data says Vermont should be very red. So at some point, that's going to call home and Vermont's going to shift red again. It's just really peculiar, specific peculiarities of the current climate in Vermont that keeps it blue. Every other factor suggests it should be red. Like, if I make a model of the Vermont election right now, and I fed it national data, not Vermont-specific data, national data, it would be deep red. So... Vermont's very peculiar, but this general northeast here, keep an eye out here. Georgia, yeah. Arizona, keep an eye out on that. Nevada. Like, there's a couple states that are currently shifting. So, I'll just finish that train of thought here and just cover up the couple of races here that have actually had polls last week. So, the three big ones, the ones that are actually kind of interesting here. We have Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. I think New Hampshire's actually a really interesting race, but there's just not a lot of polls for it. So there's been no polls in the last week, so there's no point in updating my comments on New Hampshire, whatever. But Pennsylvania has shifted slightly less blue, slightly towards Oz. Fetterman still has an advantage, but right now it's like 49.5 to 47.6 or something like that. So it's narrowly in favor of Fetterman. I still don't know if there's going to be enough time, assuming current trends continue, for it to actually flip for Oz. And it could very well be the case that at this point, Oz might be hitting a soft brick wall, because the last month or so, what really has happened politically is Oz has rallied 2020 Trump voters who were likely sitting home, and he's pretty much gotten all of those now. So now it's really a battle between the few swing voters, or possibly poaching some of the less competent voters from Fetterman, and very importantly, driving your turnout. I don't know what Oz's turnout machine looks like. He seems to be quite good as a, what's the word for this? He seems to be a very diligent campaigner, so I assume his get out to vote effort will also be very diligent, so that might help push him over the edge. Because keep in mind, get out the vote is almost as important as being popular when you're talking about elections, so Pennsylvania for this election is something to really watch out for on election night. This one is going to be razor thin, I think. It's going to be nail biting. I think what we'll see if current trends continues, I think every couple updates will cause it to be going back and forth red-blue until either Philadelphia is exhausted and it stays red, or Philadelphia is exhausted and it stays blue. The question really is the dead up to vote in Philadelphia, I think. If Philadelphia votes strongly, I think Fetterman should win. But if they stay home, it should probably go Oz. But we'll see there. Down over here, skip a bit to Arizona. Arizona is now moved. I now have Masters with a 3-point lead, like 50 to 47 or something. It looks like he might have passed the point of contention here. If my model is correct, and the polls are decent, he might be past the point. And yes, I know all the polls are saying Kelly is technically leading, but there's more to consider than just headline poll numbers. There's historical polling error, and there's lots of on the ground things in Arizona to consider. Obviously, one, Kelly's run a pretty mediocre campaign. He didn't do particularly well in debates from what I've seen. I didn't watch the debates entirely. I literally do not have enough time to watch every debate in every state. And I really didn't watch many of them. I only watched snippets of both because I have like 20 to 30 hours a week to do this for this channel. Not even really. It's probably closer to 20 on average. So, you only get the detail level of what I can do in 20 hours in a week. But from what I've seen in Arizona, the debate didn't look particularly good for Fetterman. Fetterman is pretty heavily damaged by voting so thoroughly with Biden on a lot of really core issues that Arizonans feel very strongly about right now, such as the border and the immigration crisis. Fetterman's voted pretty much lockstep with Biden, I think always, but particularly on these issues. I say Fetterman, I meant Kelly. And that really has hurt Kelly because it's really killed his credibility on these issues because Biden's done nothing. And if anything, you could argue Biden's actually made the migration crisis worse in statements he said and things his administration has done. Though, if you don't want to go that far, at the very least, the complete negligence to do anything hasn't made it better. And that's quite hurting Kelly. And Masters recently, in Masters, I think, is going to be carried on the coattails of Lake, who is riding much stronger position in the polls, just in raw terms, and also just mathematically, she's doing better. That doesn't really make sense, but we're going with it. So I think she's also going to help carry Masters over the line. He might not win by the margin my model currently says, but I think he should be winning at this point. It's kind of hard to forecast margin of error on these things because, as I might have said before, I don't know. I don't really like forecasting margin of error because it's kind of meaningless because I can't actually calibrate my model. Like, I can calculate a margin of error. That's not hard. The problem is I can't actually calibrate if the margin of error means anything because I only get one election. There's only one election between Kelly and Masters. Once that's over, we're not getting another one, so I don't know. I can't calibrate the margin of error, but outside of a personal preference level, academically speaking, like, the margin of error is probably like 5% here. So, yes, Masters is leading by 3, but I think it's actually within margin of error considering the polls, quantity, and considering the specificity of a state-level race. So, yes, softly within margin of error. I think Masters should win. The model says Masters should win. I think the model's correct on this one. I don't always think my model's correct, and I always say when it isn't. The one that's very interesting here, though, the one I left to last, Georgia. Good old Georgia. At this point, I think we are down to Walker has a 1.5 lead. I don't know if that changed from last week because I didn't write numbers down, because of course I didn't. Walker has like a 1.5 point lead here. going into this last stretch, and the polls might have leveled. So I don't know if his round one numbers are going to change wildly at this point. The big catch here will be turnout. And turnout might carry Walker over the line, because in general terms, I expect the Republicans to have a higher turnout. They have much higher voter enthusiasm than the Democrats are, and generally speaking, the incumbent party in a midterm turns out less than the opposition. So that historical trend, and also just the very real voter enthusiasm by polling, I think might carry Walker over the line here, but it's pretty narrow, and at the moment they're both below 50%, so who knows what will happen in a runoff. It's almost impossible to actually forecast a runoff at this point. I did look into it, and there's just no polls. Like, there might be one or two, I don't know, I didn't look too closely, but all of the core polls I would actually need to do this, ones that actually provide demographic level data, none of those have a round two runoff proposal or ballot test. So who knows what would happen in the runoff. I'm inclined to say, based off of who the third parties are right now, that it might go to Walker, but I could really see it going to Warnock, who's the incumbent. It's kind of hard to say. Overall, I would say at this point, there is a decent chance. I could be right on the number of seats in the Senate, but I could have Pennsylvania classified wrong, and I could have Georgia classified wrong. I would be very surprised. This would require a big polling miss, I think, for the Republicans to win Georgia and Pennsylvania, and New Hampshire for that matter. That would require, I think, a pretty big polling miss. Now, obviously, we still have about 2 weeks, give or take. Slightly more, but for the for all practical terms, about 2 weeks. So a lot could happen in 2 weeks. But it looks like the magnitude of trends are kind of clamping down across the board. So I think 52-48 seems pretty locked in here. The Republicans could theoretically get up to 54, or could go as low as 51. I don't see them. I think 50 is kind of out of the question now. The odds of them losing New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Arizona are pretty low. And you even want to go further in saying the Democrats will win the Senate. That seems extremely unlikely, because then the Republicans have to lose not only those four, but also Wisconsin. That seems extraordinarily unlikely here. I guess it is technically possible, because I think Wisconsin's only like a 3.5 lead. But that would be where we would be talking about some pretty comical polling error here. And comical in the other way. Like, normally their poll, or not normally, the last decade or so, the polls have typically overestimated the Democrats. This would require the polls to be overestimating the Republicans, which I won't say it's impossible, but I'd be very surprised. I've not really seen any indication that that's the case, so we will see. And I'll just end off on this one last note here, that on the just ground level concerns with the generic ballot where it is right now as I record this, and the trends in like the economy and such, I think we should expect the Republicans to win the Senate. The question is it 51, or like is it Where in the 51-54 range will it be? 55 is pretty much a pipe dream at this point. Both Colorado and Washington are +8. And a lot of the other states don't really have good polls, but it would be shocking to see like Maryland or New York or Connecticut or Vermont go red, Senate-wise. Same thing with California, Illinois. Maybe Oregon? I had to double check the Senate race there, but I don't think the Senate race is actually that close. It's definitely not closer than Washington or Colorado, so 55 is pretty much a pipe dream. The odds of that happening is probably significantly lower than the Democrats winning the Senate. And I think the Democrats winning the Senate is basically nothing. Like, it's not going to happen. So, with that, I'll bid you adieu. If you liked the video, please like, share, subscribe, comment below. Let me know if you think I should focus more on the politics and less on like trends and what's happening and analysis. Let me know. I always like to figure out if I'm hitting the right balance between what is currently happening and what trends are happening and what underlying things are causing things to be the way they are. I try to hit a balance between those two because I feel like if I do too much of one or too much of the other, it gets kind of boring. So I could do both, or well, trying to touch both of them. Let me know if you think I'm hitting the right balance there, or if you think, no, you hate that kind of stuff. I don't know. Let me know. I can make the videos better if you let me know. Otherwise, I bid you all adieu, and I will see you Sunday with another Congress update.